to Jan Reichelt. Jan is co-founder and president of Mendeley. Most of you are familiar with Mendeley, but just in case you're not, they launched in 2009. They've already managed to collect 1.5 million users, which I think is an astonishing rate of growth. Around about 150 million documents on that platform. So, that is deeply, deeply impressive in my book. Also, Jan is fascinated with Latin American dance, and that's also very impressive too. So, welcome Jan to the stand.
Now, when I don't do Mendeley, I do that, which is almost never. Good, so social integration. What I want to do is I want to show a little bit how Mendeley thinks about this aspect of social integration, and I don't claim that Mendeley would have the solution to all the issues and questions, but I think I can demonstrate a couple of examples how we make progress and how we are trying to experiment and where we see uptake of what's happening and what for a publisher and what my recommendations would be how we could look at the industry and what's happening in terms of social integration. I'm not sure how many people of you really know what Mendeley is. Unfortunately, for those people who know that, I'll just do a little repetition, 3 slides about how Mendeley works and how we got started. So Mendeley is a desktop software, web software that lets you organize research documents. So it's cross-platform, we have mobile applications, and you can simply drag and drop PDF documents in that application. And the application then extracts data from those PDF documents and builds up your reference library automatically. Then it lets researchers organize and annotate those papers. So we have an internal PDF viewer where you can, make highlights, sticky notes. We have shared collections, shared groups where people can jointly collaborate and make sticky notes and highlights. So it's all integrated in the workflow in private. So it's all happening in private groups. But we also have public groups where then people can discuss their research publicly, where people can curate reading lists of documents, references, and so forth. So there's these two aspects, something going on in private with smaller groups of researchers, maybe in a lab, and where in other cases public groups where people try to expose content and demonstrate that they have expertise in a field. Indeed, we've seen a rapid growth of what we're doing, so we apparently are fulfilling a need and solving a problem. It's cross-disciplinary, that's also very interesting, and we see groups emerging across disciplines. So, for us, the traditional differentiation between disciplines is not so important. It's more like that those groups and the activities are emerging based on how people are interacting with the content, and we track, for example, where people are signing up from, and we see that the traction really comes from top-profile universities. In terms of documents that people upload and share in their accounts, we've also seen a tremendous take-up of documents. Roughly 60 million of those documents are unique, but it's good for us either way. If there's a document that's already in the database, that adds to the readership statistics of the data that we aggregate publicly. If there's a new document being added, then our database becomes more complete. The unique thing about what we're doing is we aggregate anonymously in the cloud the user-generated information. So we expose on a public Mendeley article page, for example, metadata such as the abstract information, but also the number of readers, where those readers are based, the discipline of those readers, and so forth. So it's very unique user-generated information that we are making available and transparent to other users. So let me talk about social integration, and I want to structure that along 3 points. I think we look at that from 3 points. One is, so how can we socially integrate into the individual workflow? Now, we have an advantage, we have this workflow tool, but maybe you as a publisher also have thought about offering workflow tools or integrating with workflow tools. And so here I'm going to talk about how we see that and why that is actually pretty successful. Then social integration more the public way, what are people doing publicly and why are they doing that? And then there's another way, which is more via data and apps and a recombination of data, so where we expose data and give other people then the opportunity to pick that from Mendeley, and it doesn't happen on Mendeley, it happens somewhere else, and then a new social ecosystem emerges based on that. Why is it important to think about that? And one way about this aspect of social integration, and one way I would like to demonstrate that is, if you think of the world today, and that matches very nicely with you, Richard, what you said initially, where there are these three question marks in the lower right corner. For me now, that's the top sliver of what I'm going to show. Right now we have a lot of content out there that's being put out by publishers, valuable content. On top of that, there's like the metadata, so semantic enrichment and so forth. So that's sometimes being done by publishers and sometimes being done by service providers. And then we have a very tiny sliver on top of that, which is what I would call the social layer right now. It's very hard to identify a lot of companies in our space who do that. I would think Mendeley is one of them, but I think that's how the world looks like right now. But what happens if in 5 years from now it looks like that? So that the social layer becomes so much more important and such a big filter, as it is the case in the consumer web with things like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Pinterest, that the social layer is the basis for people creating and sharing stuff, that this is the result. So that's why I think we need to think about how can we add the social layer, how can we use the social layer and make it valuable for the industry, because again, in the consumer web, this has happened, and only those people who know how to play this social game, they are staying on top. Interestingly, I will look into Pinterest a little bit further as well, so it's funny that it seems to be the new hot star in the field. Maybe next year it's a different company, but now it's Pinterest. So let's look at the social integration into the individual workflow. Within Mendeley, you have the internal PDF viewer. What we will enable, and what we already have enabled, is commentaries, enabling people to comment on different sections within the PDF document. That's all happening in private, so we are not exposing who is saying what outside of that private group. You also cannot access that private group from outside. It's really as designed as a workflow tool to help people collaborate in small groups in a lab, in a setting of where 3 authors have to write a paper and so forth. And the good thing is, this is happening there explicitly. But what we can do then is, so the incentivization for the individual user is they're doing that in order to get benefit for themselves. But we can then aggregate that anonymously. So, for example, we could create a heat map for a PDF article and expose that heat map on an article page and say, these are the most discussed sections. We wouldn't say, this and this professor have said this and that, but apparently there's a huge discussion going on about the conclusion of that specific paper or the methods section. And that works because we integrate in the workflow. People are incentivized to do that for their own benefit, and then Mendeley as a social network, as a research network, benefits from that activity. So this is the explicit activity that people do, which leads to emerging social information. But there's also implicit stuff going on that we are thinking about. So there's explicit, implicit. Implicitly, people are using documents in order to build their library. They are collecting references for their research, for their work. These reading lists, these individual libraries, then allow us to generate very personalized recommendations. And again, we see that as a very successful example. Amazon, collaborative filtering, you see the lower bottom there, customers who bought this item also bought. It's a very, very successful way for Amazon to drive content and make sales. Another example is iTunes, where you have the Genius bar on the right-hand side, which just looks at what kind of music you're listening to and then drives recommendations based on your individual library. Now, we simply did the same for research, and I think it's a very successful model where we have developed a tool called Mendeley Suggests. And by now, it is so good that a user from scratch only needs to add 3 articles for the recommendations to be relevant for that individual user. If the individual user adds 20 articles, we can the Mendeley Suggest has an 80% acceptance rate, meaning that if we give 10 suggestions, 8 of those will be accepted by the user. And this is possible because we track the implicit usage of that user. So there's the explicit activity and the implicit usage, and that drives the social activity on Mendeley. On the public in the public fashion look like? Again, like in the public fashion, you have your, for example, public Facebook profile. People putting up stuff because they want to be perceived as, maybe cool or whatever. They would just want to share joy. They want to share their holiday experiences. Now we've just again simply adapted that and made that happen in Mendeley, where for groups, collaborative groups, private as well as public, people can follow what's going on in that group. If somebody has added a document, then people start discussing based on that document. So the conversation is starting to emerge on the social object of science, which right now is the PDF document. And I would agree with Paul that it's not an optimal way, but it's the way it is being done right now. And ideally, we would be able to break that down. I'll come in smaller pieces, and I'll come to that in a bit. But again, you have an explicit sharing of information in a public or in a private group. What we will do going forward is we will encourage people to demonstrate publicly what they're reading. So you have an opt-in, opt-out model where people can then say, yeah, I'm happy for other people to see what I'm actually reading because I want to share that information and I want maybe to be perceived as an expert in that field and so forth. But again, there's a lot of implicit stuff that we can anonymously aggregate. So even if somebody doesn't publicly expose or adds a document to a public group, we can still generate, let's say, a page for a specific discipline or a specific tag where we aggregate all the social activity that's going on around that topic. So here you can see a discipline page about biological sciences, where you see the most popular groups that people are engaged in. You see the most popular papers in that discipline. You see popular tags on the upper right-hand corner that have been added by users regarding that discipline. You see the most active members. So again, just by simply tracking what's going on for the individual users, honestly, we can then generate this implicit usage and expose that.
Same thing is on a more granular level. If you go to an article page, you see the abstract article information. But what we then expose is, for example, we show the readership statistics for that article. We don't identify anybody individually, unless that person wants to make that public in the future, as you've seen with this little screenshot. But we say, this article has been read by 30 people in a specific discipline, coming from Japan, and their status is PhD student or professor. And anonymously aggregating that usage information. And we generate related research in order to show people, what else could they read based on that specific article that they're interested in. So that's social integration, how we think about it the public way. And again, we don't know what is the best solution here, but we're trying different things, and I think some of those ideas will stick going forward. Third step, social integration via data, apps, and a recombination of information. And here's where I'm coming back to Pinterest. So Pinterest allows, recombination of existing stuff out there. And the interesting thing there is, it's not so much about generating original content, it's about recombination of existing content that then, interestingly, people find so interesting that those people who put up the recombination are able to make money with that. And I think that's a great opportunity for us and for publishers to harness and to remonetize already existing content by enabling people to reshare, recombine, and then monetize on that additional activity. Just to demonstrate the impact, obviously, Pinterest is a general consumer research site, consumer site. It's not like scientifically related, but it just shows, in science, I feel we're pretty stagnant because we are not embracing those social activities, whilst a site like Pinterest is able to pick up very. The other aspect of that is it's not only about the absolute number of people who come to that site, but also how deeply do they engage with that content. So it's not only about the total number of readers in Mendeley, for example, but it's also how deeply do they engage with the content. And here you can see that Pinterest does a very good job at that. And I guess you would all agree with that, and you already know that. Why is it so important for publishers? Because in the end, it's, how do we get the people to use the content that we produce in the in STM? So recombination of content. Again, I don't think we as Mendeley, we want everything to happen on Mendeley. So that's in line basically with what Paul said. You don't need to have everything on your platform. You don't need to give everything away at the same time. So what we are trying to do is we try to make the content and put it, again, on our site, break it down into smaller pieces. So for example, here, this is a blog of Jonathan Eisen, a professor at UC Davis. And what he does is he curates a couple of public reading lists on Mendeley, public groups. And
what we allow users to do is we allow users to take these reading lists and embed them somewhere else. So, we don't care if people come to Mendeley or if they use it somewhere else. We think about this sharing, embracing the activity, and allowing people to create new things. What he did is he wrote a blog post and he added a reading list of documents to that blog post, and you can then see in the lower half of that, there are 11 comments. So people are seeing the content, and then it's our mission to get them to a Mendeley article page where we then try to link back to the publisher. But we can only do so if we know what the publisher's content is and if we can break the content down into smaller pieces. So I think atomization of content, breaking down the PDF into smaller pieces and allowing people to reuse and reshare that will allow for more value creation. Another example is, this is from the New York Times online version.
And somebody has developed a small plugin for Chrome. And this plugin, when clicked, queries the Mendeley database, the open API that we've developed, and the Mendeley Open API then sends back a couple of references, list references that you can see on the right-hand corner, where then somebody can say, okay, this topic is interesting to me, and I want to know more, let's say, hardcore stuff about that topic, more academic stuff. And this little plugin delivers those references and links to that person, and then the person can then go to a Mendeley article page, see what other people are saying, which groups, and so forth. So we kick off the social engagement, we drive content usage and interaction. But again, it's not only that we are all doing it. We are very open with the data, so we have this open API, and we let other people then create applications on top of that. So this is an application called Clank, where people can create links between articles and can assign values to those links. So it's a little bit like citations, but they have a value assigned to that. So you can say this article supports or rejects or builds on. And if you imagine this is crowdsourced across, a million researchers or a couple of thousand researchers, depending on the discipline, you get a totally new social network, research network, because people are able to reuse the content and create something based on the data that's already out there. Another application that has been built by somebody who's not affiliated with Mendeley is Paper Critic, where people can then rate papers and can write little comments and so on, and then they in turn integrate with Twitter. So again, they in turn allow sharing. So it's building those, building blocks for people to allow and share content and let them create something. Who knows? Maybe Paper Critic will not exist in a year anymore, but some other application. Maybe some more serious stuff is the winner of Mendeley's binary battle. So we had a contest developer challenge running last year where we encouraged people to build on the data that we expose in order to create something and have that share with the community. And the winner there was OpenSNP, OpenSNP, which lets people compare their own gene information, which they can get from 23andMe and similar service providers, and do a search across a literature database and then get relevant research results and see which other people are reading these kind of documents. And I think these are actually pretty interesting and very valuable applications going forward. Another way to think about it is, okay, we have thought about the applications and the tools that people can create. I think the other aspect of that is, who do we want to address this to? And I get the feeling that many people in the industry traditionally think about, okay, we need to address this to scientists. Let's think about the scientists. I believe we should think much more broadly. There's so much unused potential, and I also think that the access models, both being in terms of licensing as well as in terms of what's the item that we put out there for people to reuse, is not really optimal. Examples here, I just want to pick maybe one or two from these three. Let's take the group of birdwatchers. So I was talking at a panel during the Google Social Media Week in New York. I think it was last year. And on the panel there was I think, founder of a birdwatching group. And he said, we have millions of birdwatchers out there. Apparently the birdwatching community is bigger than soccer and tennis together in the US. Couldn't happen in Germany, but apparently in the US that's the case. So those people are amateur experts. They have, partially obsession. They have an obsession with what they're doing. They're in their daytime jobs. They're maybe
police officer, or whatever they are, but it's what they like to do apart. So he said those people are craving for content, right? And
the problem they have is they don't see that content and they don't get access to that content. And so the first step I think we need to think about is how do we get that content in a format that is interesting to those people? We don't know the solution. I would doubt that the publishers would have the one golden bullet. But if we create an infrastructure that lets other people create it, they will find their own solution. They will find a way how they want to consume the content if we give them the content in the right way, in the right structure. Another example, again, maybe more serious, cancer patients. So there's a group out there, ACOR, Association of Cancer Online Resources, acor.org. I think like 60,000 people are it's a mailing list, basically, membership, and they mail PDF documents to each other via mailing lists, right? All this activity is not visible neither to Mendeley nor probably to any of the publishers. And I think we should not prevent that from happening because it's critical for those people, but we should embrace those sharing activities and we should surface that and then find ways how we can then monetize. And again, I think those people would really be willing to pay if they knew what they could be accessing and what the value of that content is to them. So the summary of that. I think social interaction is not just about links. Again, also what Paul said earlier. It's about the user experience. So it's a much more broader concept. What do you as a publisher want the user to experience when they access your content? Right? Do you want them to experience a clumsy PDF download? Or do you want to experience them more? And again, it's something that you have to answer for yourself. The question then is, what's the role of a publisher? What do you want to do? Do you provide a user experience? Do you make sure that the content is scientifically sound? Do you add branding experience, expertise? So something that maybe I think you need to answer for yourself. I think it's also more than just a social network about, here we have a social network with 1 million users, 1 million profiles. I think it's much more. SDM can offer much more. So we have all this valuable content. We have the data. Science is changing the world. It's defining the world going forward. So it's not about, how many profiles can we get up? It's more about how can we build a research network. And that is not only Mendeley, that includes everybody, I think, in that community, that lets people interact with each other and share stuff and build stuff. But in order to allow that, the social integration requires atomization of content. So we need to embrace and surface those new ways of sharing. And we need not to restrict that, but we should think about creative ways. How can we embrace what's already happening, surface that, and then find ways how to encourage that and monetize that. And then again, think about the broader audience, not only about the scientists. Also interesting, think about explicit. People are doing something, I put that on my profile, but there's so much happening implicitly on which we can build. And then I think in STM, making the social data available via APIs, and that's the mission that we have, enables these new contextual forms of content discovery, which will then drive usage and engagement, which I think everybody should be interested in. And that's really the heart of social, and I think that's our mission and where we're trying to support the ecosystem. Thank you.
So we'll take a couple of questions for Jan now, I think, and I can see. Is anyone coming up to the mic, or shall I kick off with something? Maybe this is going to be a bit of a technical question, Jan, in which case we shouldn't go too deeply into it. But I was intrigued by the bookmark that you showed, where content on the New York Times was being related back to deeper research papers inside the Mendeley platform. Again, showing an opportunity to sort of to reach out into a wider context. That actually works. Could you give us any detail, a little bit, on how you,
not the bookmark piece, but how you're actually creating the relationship between that news article and the content in the database?
So I think from a technical perspective, that happens by just extracting the title of that HTML page, sending it as a search term to Mendeley's API, and Mendeley's API then delivers back 10 links, most relevant links based on keywords, based on how many readers, those like relevancy in terms of how many readers and so forth. So it's early stages, and I'm not suggesting that we have found out what is really relevant, but I think it's the first step.
Okay. Do we have a question from the audience?